Done. Okay,
great. Okay, cool. Okay, welcome to the session on economics. This session is going to have you 3 disclaimers. Firstly, this is aimed specifically for people who have not studied economics before, mainly because I think people who have studied economics are normally quite good at it and don't need the help as much. But that also means that it's deliberately trying to avoid making incredibly technical arguments. So if you're here to like be wowed by sort of fun, interesting technical arguments you can make about economics within a debate context, that's not the right place. The second disclaimer is that these are my opinions. At some points you might think that I'm wrong, at some points you might think that I'm right. I'm willing to, you're welcome to ask questions and to challenge me, but don't take this necessarily as the gospel truth and something that all judges will buy at all times, although I do think that it broadly reflects the consensus of the judging that's out there. And the third thing to say is that I probably won't be able to solve all of the economic debates problems that you've ever had. So I had a couple of messages where people gave me some examples of some like previous motions that they found incredibly difficult to tackle. Broadly, I thought that those were motions that were set in and around the financial crisis, so to do with like specific ways that mortgage-backed securities worked, or specific types of debt obligations, which is something that I think was more current affairs knowledge at the time, and I wouldn't necessarily expect to see a to set now, but that is just saying that like this won't actually go into that much detail about like how the global financial crisis happened, or even financial organizations, and probably won't best equip you for financial debates, but there are time constraints and I can only do so much. Okay, who am I? So I'm Hannah, I study here at LSE, and I also am president of the debate society here. I debate relatively successfully, so I have a world and a Euros break, so hopefully this advice will be useful. The next thing to talk about is I'm just going to give you 4 basic concepts, which are economic concepts, which are things that I feel like I use in economics all the time and are really useful. The first is a poverty trap, which I think is fundamental to understanding any form of development economics debate. So one of the basic principles in economics is that you need to invest before you can get money. So if I want to become a farmer, I need to be able to buy seeds before I can grow crops to get that seed. So all economic growth involves a time lag. If I need to build a factory before I can produce the goods, but also I need to do things like go to school before I can reap the rewards of the education. So there's often in economics a time lag between when you get the benefits and when you have to put down a substantial investment. A poverty trap is where you do not have enough money in order to invest, whether that be in human capital or physical capital. So there are lots of examples to this with doing with people working in farms as opposed to going to schools because they need the subsistence agriculture in order to stay alive. People having people living in rural areas where there are only jobs during harvest season, but they don't have enough money for the bus ticket to take them to an area where there would be more jobs. So there are lots of examples of where people don't have enough money in order to escape from poverty. This can be solved by aid, just giving them things and giving them money, by foreign capital, other people doing the investment, by saving enough over long periods of time so you have enough investment. So all sorts of different ways in which microfinance is another good example where you just borrow the money in order to pay it back afterwards. So effectively, at the core of all development debates are trying to escape the poverty trap. I think that's a really good conceptual way of thinking about development. Second is opportunity cost, which is just basically this is summed up in the phrase that there's no such thing as a free lunch. So it's the idea that you can get every time you do something, you lose an alternative. So very literally, the fact that you're here today means that you can't be listening to Gareth about war, which would have also been useful to you. But it's the idea that every time someone does a job, they are unable to do another job. So the idea is that you can never get something for free. If you are spending money on a radiator, you cannot also be spending money on hot chocolate. So there's always a loss of other alternatives. So that's a really good idea, especially if people have very liberal arguments about why don't we just give people all the things that they want? Because by giving someone something, you're necessarily denying them an opportunity to do something else. So there's an opportunity cost to that. The third one is Pareto efficiency. So Pareto efficiency is a goal that economists strive for. So they strive to achieve an allocation of resources where they can make everyone better off without making anyone else worse off. So specifically in the context of things like redistribution, if I were to give everyone in this room a bar of chocolate, I would be making everyone else better off. However, if I were to take 20 bars of chocolate from Olivia and give one to everyone in this room, I would then actually, that would not be Pareto efficient because someone would be worse off in the process of making everyone else better off. So this is something that we talk about in trade. It's going to come up a lot when we talk about trade, so keep that idea in the back of your mind. The last thing I want to talk about is the difference between micro and macro, because this sometimes confuses people quite a lot, and I think it's quite a good conceptual difference to think about. So micro markets are small scale markets, so the housing market, the labour market, the market for university degrees, and those are all things that have an individual price mechanism and can be modelled with supply and demand. So there is a supply of houses and a demand for houses, and broadly the supply of houses and the demand for houses is not too dissimilar to the supply of fish and the demand for fish, or even the supply of university degrees and the demand for university degrees. So that's one set of economic debates. There's a second set of economic debates which are to do with the way the whole economy runs. So they care about unemployment, they care about inflation, they care about GDP, they care about broad understandings of how people are doing, which is obviously very different to talking about specific markets. And so you can't describe the economy, or even what Brexit's impact on the economy is, by using demand and supply, because you're not talking about specific goods. And that means that you need to look at more holistic measures of the economy. And I think being very clear in debates about whether this is a microeconomics debate or a macroeconomics debate is sometimes very useful. The labour market is both. The labour market can be measured with demand and supply, but also has implications on unemployment. So it's not necessarily a clear distinction, but I think it's a very good one to have in mind. Okay. A couple of people asked me for a resource list. So this is just a brief one. I get most of my information from podcasts, and I think that the best economics podcast is the Planet Money podcast, which is done by NPR. They have about 700 episodes in their back catalogue, and I have listened to all of them. So I'm genuinely able to do quite specific recommendations, especially if you have questions. They did on trade, so they produced a t-shirt and they went around to Bangladesh to see that t-shirt being produced and saw the effect of the factories and people in Bangladesh. They went to Brazil and they talked about cotton tariffs. So I think that's a really good one if you want to understand specifically more about trade. Deloitte does a weekly economics email briefing, which I subscribe to, which is actually very useful. So it normally takes one big topic a week and breaks that down, and normally has quite a lot of analysis in there, as well as the second half of the email, which is about market trends, which you can ignore. But that is actually quite a good source of weekly economics briefing. The Economist just produced a series on 6 big economic ideas, all of which I think are quite useful. And then if you want to read books, both of those 2 books, this one for macroeconomics and this one for microeconomics, are good places to start. But this will be online, so you don't need to write it down now. Okay. Part 1. They're going to be 3 parts, although I think there's probably only going to be time for 2. The first part is I want to try and make economics debates thought of in the same way you'd think of any other debates. So to kind of like dispel the mystique that economics debates are somehow different or somehow harder. So try and make you think about economics debates like you would think about any other debate. The second part of the talk, I want to talk about things people say that they necessarily shouldn't say, or things that people find really hard to argue for, and try and explain how you can use economic reasoning to try and argue for some quite unpopular positions. So, what is debating about? I think one of the ways you can conceptualize debating is that it's about trade-offs. So obviously not all motions are like this, because I can't ensure that CAs always set good motions, but normally you'd expect a motion to have some benefits attached to it and also some harms attached to it. And your role as a team is to argue why those benefits and harms might not exist, but ultimately, not only do you have to argue why those things are true, you also have to argue why those things are important. And that involves trade-offs between 2 good things. So I think if you conceptualize debating about the idea of trading off different values, that's a very useful way of also thinking about economics. So economics is about a lot of things, but one of the things it's about is distributing goods, right? It's about allocating resources. It's about, if I have 100 chocolate bars in this room, how many chocolate bars do I give to everyone? And that's over, so I need to distribute those chocolate bars over people, but I also need to distribute those chocolate bars over time. So I might give them to you all now, I might give them to you next year. And I also need to care about outcomes like everyone getting fat. So I also need some social priorities to do with how I want to distribute those chocolate bars. And I think that economics is about trading, about looking at different ways of distributing resources, and there are trade-offs within economics. So I'd now like you to chat to your partner and have some thoughts about what sort of things you might trade off in economics. So I think one that lots of people remember is the idea of, do we search for GDP or do we search for like happinomics, or people being happier, which was a big thing that David Cameron tried to push in 2010. But if you just want to chat to your partner and see if you can think of some other things that we might be trading off in economics, some values which can sometimes come into conflict with each other. I'll give you 2 minutes.
I don't think it's possible to manage without mind like you can't manage. Someone might be happy like one day in their life. Someone might be extremely happy. And I'll be the half.
Okay, you guys just want to finish up. There are 5 tables, so I'm probably going to do each 5 table in turn. Do you two mind if I start with you? What sort of trade-offs do you think there are in economics?
Right, we thought about the trade-off between protectionism and liberalization.
Yeah.
So, yeah, if a country decides protectionism, more jobs to domestic people, but it reduces choices for consumers.
Yeah, that's really good. So it's about people having jobs, but also choice. So you're trading off the outcomes of 2 different groups in society. One are specific people with specific jobs who might therefore find it become unemployed for a long period of time and their welfare. And the other thing is that we think that consumers are happier if they have more choice. So we think that I'm happier if you give me 10 types of chocolate bars to choose from than if there's just like one standard type of chocolate bar. And those 2 things need to be weighted. Good example. Okay, imperial table. What have you got?
Austerity versus government spending.
Okay, what do you think the trade-off is there?
One side is cutting government spending, and then therefore cutting down the debt. The other side is to spend more money to stimulate the economy.
Yeah, I think that trade-off is a short-term, long-term trade-off. So I think that the people who spend money now think we need to like increase unemployment today, or we need to give people services today. And the people who want to have austerity, the people who want to cut debt, basically want there to be better for future generations. So future generations don't have as much as a debt burden to pay off. So I think that debate is about whether we prioritise the needs of citizens today or whether we prioritise the citizens of the next generation. And that's another good example of like a way in which you can conceptualise that debate in a way that I think is much easier to understand, because I'm sure that everyone in this room can come up with argumentation about whether citizens today or citizens in the future are more important. Okay, cool. Third table, LSE table.
You said maybe trade-offs, like individuals have to make trade-offs, so not just in how they prioritize their own money, but like between private wealth and altruism or like charity redistribution.
Yeah, no, I think that is true. I think that, yeah. Can you think of a debate where that would be in?
Forcing some kind of charity, like forcing.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that there are definitely lots of debates that are around like ideas like effective altruism and ideas about charity and like what the government should mandate is charitable. So about whether we should prioritise people feeling like they've done good or whether we should prioritise like empirical studies that show that they've done good. Yeah, I think that is a good one. Okay, table number 4.
Efficiency versus equity.
Yeah, cool. Can you expand a bit?
Yes, so in most economics, the more you increase efficiency, there's often times where the equity decreases because of like rent seeking and all that.
Yeah, exactly. So we can make the pie bigger, or we can cut it up differently. And not those things are often contradictory, you're right. So there are things like incentive, if you have additional incentives for the rich, they're more likely to do well, but that also means that they'll get a higher share of the overall income. There's a hand.
What does equity mean?
That's in about 4-5 slides time. So once we've talked about that, can we? I also think that it varies on debate. So I think that when you're talking about inequality, you should break it up into regional inequality or like job-based inequality. So we will talk a lot about different ways inequality happens in debates. Give me a couple of slides, and then you can ask questions then if you still have them.
I know, I remember like the money equity thing. I thought that's what you meant.
No, I think, do you meant equity in terms of like inequality, right? Yeah. Okay, table number 5.
Consumption and investment.
Yeah, no, so that's very good. So going back to the poverty trap I was talking about, I might want to have my daughter work in a field in order that there's more food for that family to have. Or I might want her to go to school to invest so she can get a better job in the future. And there is a trade-off there in terms of also short-term, long-term benefits. Cool. Okay, I think there are probably 3 categories that we're going to talk about. And we're always going to trade them off against growth. So trade them off against the economy getting richer. The first is distribution, so how we share the pie. This is also can be the inequality section. The second one I want to talk about is stability. So I think in debates about things like FDI, often FDI can make your country very rich. But if, for example, there's a political shock, it can all flood out again. So it's very unstable investment, and talking about why that might or might not be a good thing, which also a lot of the debates about trade and protectionism is in the first table we're talking about, is also about how much job stability we should give people. And thirdly, I want to trade it off against other values, whether that be the environment. I think we trade off GDP and the environment a lot. Sovereignty, we can have a little chat about Brexit, that sort of stuff. It's a non-exhaustive list, as you know, because there were lots of other things you said that were very smart. Ooh. Okay, distribution. This is the first bulk of things. I'm broadly going to say that there are 2 different types of debates about distribution. The first is about the jobs people have. So these are debates about whether we should pay CEOs so much money, or whether we should, whether it's okay that if you have a professional managerial job, you're earning so much more money than someone who has fewer skills than you do. So it's also sort of debates around class, and like when you hear about the middle class or the upper class getting rich. The second type of inequality I want to talk about is regional inequality, which I do think plays in debates, and we're seeing an increasing trend towards there being mega cities. So London is getting increasingly bigger and increasingly more wealthy compared to the rest of the UK, and obviously that has some like social implications for people. So those are my 2 broad categories. Okay. Yeah, no, I'll get you to do this. I want you to work in your groups again and come up with a list of some reasons that inequality might be bad. But I want these to be non-moral lists. So you might think that inequality is very unfair. You might think that I want you to try and do this solely using social outcomes and economic reasoning, right? So none of this it's unfair that if you were born wealthy, you can perpetuate that privilege. I will solely want this to be about the economic and social problems with inequality. Given how left-wing debating is, I don't think people are really going to struggle. I'll give you 2 minutes.
I guess it wouldn't be too much.
Okay, I want to try and get through as much as possible, so I'm going to go through the tables quite quickly. Just give me a headline. Why is inequality? Why might inequality be bad? Group 1.
Headline.
Just give me a social what? Sorry.
Social instability.
Yep, social instability. Good one. Group 2, Imperial.
Yeah. If you're unequal, then less able to do something you would be good at, can't get education or something.
So social mobility basically is reduced when society is unequal.
Society because you have people who would be good at stuff not doing that.
Is that distinct from social mobility? The idea that people can't get into the jobs that they're best suited to? Is the channel that mechanism happens through?
No, channel's the same.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Just checking. Group number 3. What's your reason?
I guess that return to the diminishment theory, which is had a point, so people sort of normalizing what might squirrel it away.
Yeah, so the additional pound that I pay the CEO is not spent as it has diminishing marginal utility. So the amount of utility they get from that additional pound is substantially less than the amount of utility that I would get if someone gave me money, as an example of a poor student, but probably more specifically other poor people in society. Group number 4.
Outgroup versus individualization.
Yeah, yep, good. Group number 5.
Lack of sort of broad mass of consumers can be detrimental to the economy.
Yeah, that's fair.
Rich people invest.
Yeah, so you skew the type of economy you have. Okay, this was my list of things that could happen. The first is that there's often lots of unemployment in incredibly unequal societies. So hysteresis is a jargon term which I don't recommend using in a debate, but I think is a very good thing to understand if you want to impact unemployment. So the idea is that everyone has skills which are useful in the labour market, but the longer that you're unemployed, the more you lose those skills. So people who've been unemployed for normally over 18 months find it significantly harder to then be re-employed again. So that's the idea that when people do get unemployed, you need to try and re-employ them as soon as possible in order to keep them in the labour market. So after about 18 months, people tend to drop out the labour market, often using things like disability benefit, and it's very hard to get them having jobs again and having high incomes again. Crime is probably a good example of a social outcome that's affected by inequality. The more unequal people's lives are, the more propensity there is to steal things or try and gain a better life through that. People's expectations are relative. So how happy I feel about the bag that I am carrying depends on the bags that everyone else has. Obviously, people's happiness is also absolute. So I'm not saying that people who have bags. So people's happiness is both absolute and relative. So obviously people with houses are happier than people who don't have houses, but there is also a relative effect. So if I know that people in the next street have mansions and I just have like a bog standard house, I'm going to be less happy than if they have the same sort of house as me. So how people perceive themselves and how people feel depends on the amount of wealth that other people have around them. Fourth reason is that it's self-perpetuating in the long run. So this was basically what Piketty came and said, and I feel like this is an argument that people should be able to understand, which is basically, he said that rich people invest things. Rich people invest in machines and on financial markets, and the return that you get on the financial market is higher than growth. And people who work, the amount of money they have depends on how the economy is doing broadly. So in the long run, wages are linked to how the economy is doing, and the incomes of the very rich is more likely to be linked to how the stock market's doing. But given there are economic reasons that the stock market will always be doing better than growth, that inequality will naturally self-perpetuate, because the sources of incomes for the rich are larger than the sources of incomes for like the working class or even the middle class whose income is linked to wages. I think that's a good argument, especially if you're talking about redistribution, because I think it can't be fixed by social factors. So the other team can't just stand up and say like, we'll ban private schools, because that's something that's very like inherent to the way economies run, and that's why Piketty's analysis was so revolutionary. Social mobility, which we have from the imperial table. Democratic distortion. I think that democracies are distorted if you have people who are richer and own media and have increasing amount of powers in society. And then lastly, we have the point that Matt made about the type of economy. So like a post-colonial Kenya, which is now something I know a bit about, they imported large amounts of luxury goods and large amounts of luxury cars in order to like satisfy the needs of the very rich in that society, but didn't really import other Western products which the average farmer would have benefited from. So you skew the type of goods that are available, because the goods that are available are for the people who can pay, and that means that other people are denied opportunities. Does that all make sense? On this slide, I asked the question, is redistribution the same as fairness? Because I think that when it comes to debating inequality, which I think is something that we debate in economics a lot, people often confuse the economic and the economic and social and the moral arguments. And I think that people have a tendency to jump to it is unfair, or come up with moral reasons why they dislike inequality. And I think that given the other team who's arguing for more growth is talking about economic and social arguments, countering them with other economic and social arguments is a good idea. So what I think is useful and something that I've seen is that people find it much easier to defend redistribution on moral grounds as opposed to economic grounds, and I feel like people should be able to do both. That's why we have that whole little spiel. Okay, the next point in my slide is geographic inequality. So I want you to have a little bit of a chat about what might the problems with geographic inequality be. Why is it so bad that Wales has a GDP a third of rich areas in London? Sorry, poor areas of Wales having a GDP which is about a third of rich areas in London.
Maybe even crowd and not gentrification as well. It means that like poor areas and this is the idea of like
So yeah, but that's surely like better percent. No, no, where's the
Okay, cool. We don't have that much time, so I'm just going to try and get through this as fast as possible. Let's go in the other order this time. Group 5, what's the problem with regional inequality?
Well, you can tie some of the envy stuff from before, so when it ties into, for instance, ethnic or other identity divisions, it can all get very nasty indeed.
Yep, that's true. Regions, yeah, regional inequality often maps to ethnic inequality, and there are obviously lots of social implications that follow from that. Group number 2.
Not as many people contribute to the economy.
Yeah, why does that occur?
Because like if you don't, like you were saying earlier about the opportunity cost into producing this good or like contributing to the economy, if you don't have as much money, you're not going to spend that money on investing in the future.
Yep.
You're going to spend it on other things.
Yep. Group number 3.
Yeah, so we said that there'll be like migratory flows possibly towards like rich areas because the counties are like competing now, and that might lead to things like gentrification.
Yeah, no, that's fair. That's fair. Gentrification probably is a product of this. Or yeah.
The poorer regions don't get as much. Things like don't get as much as things like infrastructure spending. It's always worth growing the economy of London by 10% because that's in absolute terms much bigger than growing the economy of Sheffield by 10% by adding a metro.
There are political incentives to favour London, and I think that we like you can definitely argue we're currently seeing that. Group number 5.
It's kind of similar to the first group that we talked about the social implications. So it could be like political division. It can lead to like secessionist movements.
Yeah, secessionist movements is a good point. Often the secessionist movements are the richer province because they don't like cross-subsidizing everyone else, intriguingly. But secessionist movements is definitely where this happens. I have fewer things to say about geographical inequality. The first is that often people are incredibly immobile. The young are quite mobile. The young are often quite willing to like up sticks and move somewhere else to get a job. But actually rates of people moving around the country are very low. Even in countries like America, which you think of as like the beacon of like labor market flexibility and people moving around and just like moving to California because there might be jobs. If you actually look what's happened in like the industrial Midwest, where lots of people have lost their jobs due to trade, actually people end up just staying there for long periods of time. So when particular communities are shocked, so when there, for example, particular jobs are lost in that community, most people stay there. So a big problem with geographic mobility, the problem with regional inequality is people are just stuck in a poorer place. And a second thing to say is that there are often community links, which is one of the reasons they stay. And there are community links which are to some extent worth protecting, right? So after my first analysis, where I say people in like Ohio chose to stay in Ohio even though there were no jobs there, you're probably thinking, why didn't they just move to California? But one of the reasons is that there's often community links, like specifically with people you know, but also more general like ethnic links. And it's very hard to transport them to other places. So often it's worth specifically investing in those communities just because they have like increased social value, which is very hard for the state to replicate. The last thing to say, which is something that was definitely picked up, is that regional inequality impacts politics through secessionist movements, through things like where investment happens, and that means that they're often self-perpetuating for those reasons. I've included geographic inequality because I think it's come up in a lot of debates. I think that it was key in the gentrification debate we talked about, even though that was inequality within London as opposed to within a country or within big cities. I also think that it's critical when we're talking about trade. I do want there to be an emphasis on trade because I think that that's what the 101 debates about. And I think that it's important to note that these communities are often incredibly immobile and will stay there even when there's no job. Okay, cool. I'm just going to do a little bit of economic history now for like 3 minutes, just to give you a understanding of why inequality is so important. After the 1980s, I've identified 5 factors that meant the world got a hell of a lot more unequal. This isn't necessarily true in Scandinavia because they had such redistributive tax policies, but in the vast majority of both the Western and the developing world, it got a lot more equal. First was ICT. Technology and computers means that the skills of managers can be enhanced because email is more efficient than sending letters, because they can research quicker. So the skills of those with degrees, high skilled workers, are enhanced, become more productive when there's technology. That also means that their wages increase. However, the skills of a retail worker aren't really affected by technology. And if they are affected by technology, there are self-service machines, which means that they lose their job. So technology has been a massively increased income inequality, and is probably the primary cause of that. The second is trade. This just basically has affected rich countries. There's been huge amounts of offshoring of traditional manufacturing jobs. It has increased everyone's GDP because we now have a wider variety of cheaper products. So it has meant that people's real incomes have risen, but for the specific communities where there's large amounts of unemployment, they have become more unequal to other parts of that country. Financial markets. It's now easier to access the financial market, so it's easier to invest in stocks and shares since the 1980s, and there was a lot of deregulation. And if you remember what I was saying earlier about Piketty, the idea that if you invest in the stock market, you're probably going to get a larger amount of growth in your income than if you have a job and you wait for your wages to rise. The fact that now middle class people find it easier to access financial markets means that they've probably become richer than before, and they can use that wealth from the stock market. Migration, I think, is a really interesting one. Again, it is true that having net migration does increase your country's GDP, but for specific jobs, it does lower your wages. So plumbers is a good example. They reckon that the average income for a plumber in the UK halved after Polish migration was allowed in, just because there was so much more competition on those jobs, because you now had a wider number of people in those semi-skilled professions. So that again has led to an increase in inequality based on what sort of jobs you do. And I haven't phrased the 5th point very well, but the idea here is that there is more mobility. So rich financial executives are much more able to pick what country they want to be in. So governments are now in a race to the bottom in order to try and have tax policy which encourages rich individuals. So the idea here is that government policy is more restricted because of globalization and the fact that people are able to move around. So there are reasons that not every country chooses to have the tax policy of Scandinavia, because they think everyone might leave. Interestingly, all 5 of these examples have made us a lot richer. All 5 of these things, maybe only 4, probably not the last one, but no one, I don't think anyone, especially an economist, would say the rise of technology was a bad thing, migration is a bad thing, financial markets are a bad thing, but they've all made the world substantially more unequal. So what I want to try and get here is spent quite a lot of time talking about why inequality was bad, but at the same time, the things that cause inequality are good. So I think there's a genuine, the way in which we balance these things is a very open question, and that's why I think there'll be a lot of debate about it in the future. Geographical inequality, a couple of things happened here. First is the rise of megacities. So technology meant that having similar businesses close to other businesses was far more economically productive. So rather than having major regional cities, you now often have one big city. So the amount of power that cities like London and Berlin, and to some extent San Francisco and New York, had within their relative countries increased. Trade also, different regions tend to have different jobs and different industries. And the fact that some of those industries were benefited by trade and some were harmed by trade means that there's now more regional inequality. And the last thing is clustering, which is the idea that firms like to be around this kind of similar point to what I was making. Firms like to be around firms which do similar things. So if you go, like, all clothes are produced in Bangladesh, not because Bangladesh is like the best at producing clothes, but because if I am a clothes manufacturer, being around other factories that produce clothes is the most efficient way for me to produce clothes, because I have skilled labor there, because there's institutional knowledge, because the supply networks are set up in a way that means it's very cheap to like import cotton. So the process by which industries have grouped has become much more common since globalization. So you have specific areas which like have highly specialized in, like for example, Silicon Valley has highly specialized in technology, and that means that rather than there being technology firms all around America, you have specific wealth generated in California, and that has increased regional inequality. So what I'm trying to show here is that the questions that we were trying to answer before are specifically relevant in the current climate. Cool. How much time do I have?
5 minutes.
Okay. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about is stability. I think stability is very important for economics. I think that, so the examples I've talked about stability are regulation. I think most regulation deals with a trade-off between safe and growth. When I am regulating a bank, I am balanced. Do I want its leverage ratio to be high, which means that it can lend more in the economy and boost GDP? Or do I want its leverage ratio to be low, because if there's a shock in the American housing market, that bank has sufficient amount of reserves, so sufficient amount of like money in order to deal with that crisis. I can explain what a leverage ratio is, but I think that the point there is that a lot of regulation deals with how safe we want things to be. International investment is another good example. So when we were talking about the poverty trap earlier, we said that FDI is a really good way of helping countries which don't have enough savings in order to invest and to build factories to give them jobs. But the problem with international investment and FDI is that it's very volatile, so it can fall very quickly if you have a political shock, or even if there's a global economic shock. So the question there is like whether we want this method to get people out of poverty, even if it might only be short term. This is why diversification might be good. I said before that there's much more regional clustering. The problem there is that if I have a particular country that, say, only really produces oil, they are incredibly vulnerable to falls in that oil price. If I, for example, in Bangladesh, and I produce a lot of clothes, if for some reason people stop buying less clothes, my whole country would be hurt, which we didn't really see in like the 1950s and 60s, where goods were produced among all different countries, as opposed to countries specifically specializing in one good. And that's also true of regions. The last point I want to make here is the boom-bust cycle. Again, there are some times when governments push in order to increase GDP, and that can eventually end up in a bust. A good example of this is the fact that we don't allow governments to pick interest rates, because governments would have an incentive to lower interest rates, because if you lower interest rates, banks lend more money, and so there's more growth in the economy. But there might also be a chance of a bust. So if banks lend too much money, and banks lend money to businesses or even households who can't repay back that money in the long term, then there might be a bust. So one of the reasons we say that is we say that the boom is short term and the bust is medium term. So we don't allow governments to control monetary policy, we don't allow governments to set interest rates, because there might eventually be a bust. I think that trade-off between short-term growth against long-term worse growth was something that came up at the beginning, but it's also a debate about stability. It's about how long-term and reliable does that growth need to be. Is it okay to just make people rich now, or do we want to make sure that they can also be rich in 10, 20 years' time? Okay, I'm gonna move on to this slide. It's probably my last slide.
You can take a little longer if you want.
So, okay, I'll take a little longer. The last thing I want to talk about is social outcomes. These debates are more political. I also think they're more interesting. The idea here is that there are lots of social outcomes that economics deals with. So education policy. Do we want our education policy to give people the skills that the workforce needs, or do we want our education policy to act as some other social instrument, to give people ideas, to allow people to be creative, or even to like facilitate social mixing? I think that the trade-off between grades and other benefits of education is also an economic trade-off. There are economic benefits to a better educated workforce, but there are other social trade-offs. I think this happens with immigration, as I was talking about. Firstly, there's the problem with immigration that it leads to inequality, but there's also problems to do with like cultural values that people might hold, and various reasons to do with why culturally people might not want immigration. I think that's a social outcome that you trade off with growth. I'll just go through my other 3 examples quickly. Labour versus leisure is an interesting one. So the longer I work, the less time I have to have fun. Should I be having fun, or should I be working, right? Like, do we want a society in which people are really rich, or do we want a society in which people are less rich, but they spend a lot of time happy with their friends and family? I think that's a trade-off economic touches on. I put sovereignty there, because I do think that, to some extent, the Brexit referendum was a trade-off between economic growth and other social outcomes. If you watch the Brexit debate, Nigel Farage was very explicit when David Cameron said there'll be less GDP growth. Nigel Farage said maybe our country doesn't want GDP growth, maybe it wants maybe it wants control back. And I do think that people did explicitly trade off being richer with having control or sovereignty. The last one is environment. Obviously, like production emits a lot of greenhouse gases, and I think that there is a trade-off between that current production and that current consumption and the future and even current lives of the people who are hurt by the environment. These debates are more political. They're often to do with who decides whether we should run things technocratically, and the explanation of why growth matters is often less generic and more dependent on the context. So what I want to quickly do now is just talk a little bit about why growth matters. And I left the slides deliberately blank because this is something people can't do, and I want you to have a little chat about why you should be how to defend economic growth. Go for it.
GDP is a measure of the amount of money that's traded between people.
Yeah.
More application. More people get the stuff they want.
Okay, we don't have much time, so I'm going to bring it back. Why might we value economic growth? Because we've just spent 30 minutes discussing why we might value things which aren't economic growth, but why might actually people being richer be good? It's what economists think are good, so there must be some reasons behind that. Let's start with table number 5, Matt Crease.
More money going around could lead to more research and more fundamental changes in the things that we can do by funding research.
Yeah, economic growth is associated with innovation. If you give people enough money, then they have time and the ability to try and figure out whether new ideas are good. A lot of that growth means that you expand people's options. Yeah, and I think that there's lots of specific debates where you can explain why innovation is specifically an outcome of your policy. So a lot of times we give people, a lot of time we want to give like entrepreneurs big paychecks, or we want to allow people to, in financial markets, to invest as much money as possible, is because we want them to be able to achieve more ideas and make the economy better. Table number 4.
Infrastructure or like state provisions?
Yeah, so if taxes stay at a constant rate, the larger the economy, the larger the tax bill, right? So like countries need to grow in order for the state to be able to do things. And some people might even make the argument that it is easier to implement more progressive tax policies when there is growth. So I think one of the good arguments you can make when you're trading off inequality and growth is to say that you need growth in order to be able to tax people. As in, like, the rich will notice a like will mind a relative decline in net income much less than an absolute decline in net income. Tip number 3.
Is there something maybe about like economies of scale and how like the bigger an economy is, the more people can interact with it, like participate in it?
I think there's an argument that the bigger economy is, the more it can do. So like the more opportunities an individual has. Yeah, that is almost certainly true. Yeah, table number 2.
If you have more, like a higher GDP, it means there's more transactions going on. So more people are paying stuff for stuff they want. So
Yeah, people are having things that they want. Big breakthrough here. People know what they want really well, and people are willing to pay money for what they want. And the more stuff that they want, the happier they are, because to some extent we are all materialistic, right? Like everyone in this room has something that they would buy if they had more money. So like I appreciate that people might think that like, oh, we just care about friends. Like to some extent we can all benefit from more money, and just like to make the argument that like people getting things makes them happy is good. I think especially if this is in a global context, people having more things with more money becomes exceptionally important within debates. Table number 5.
So this is controversial, but economic growth is certainly related to the level of democracy, especially like those developing countries, because they think about like post-materialistic values and they think less about like bread and butter.
Yeah. So 2 points here. The first is that growth normally accompanies a rising middle class, who are much more likely to be able to act as good social agents. So much more likely to have a civic society, much easier to hold governments to account. Final point that I'd make on why growth is good is that traditionally libertarians say growth equals freedom, and I think that's quite an extreme statement, but it's definitely true in the sense that the more an economy is growing, the more different jobs I can take, the more opportunities I have within that economy to actually have the outcome that I want. And I think that not only can you buy more things, you can often do more jobs and do a wider variety of jobs. And so even if you don't think that people are horribly materialistic, you probably do think that they are happier when they have an access to a wider variety of jobs. And that's another reason growth is important. I'm going to end there because I've overrun. So if you guys would like to go to Kingsway, where I will also be, and I can answer any questions there.
Woo, thanks, Hannah.